everyone, welcome to Lies, the part of extra history where I try to put right all the mistakes we've made, sort out what lies we told you, and tell you all the stories that just didn't make the cut for the show. First, I have to get this off my chest, because I've been waiting to say this since I wrote the first episode. This is the successful crusade. No other crusade in the Middle East will ever retake as much territory as the first crusade. So as far as crusades go, this is the best it gets. Okay, so now on to clearing a few things up. One of the things that struck me most when doing this was how different the conception of history was in the Middle Ages. Like in the classical period, the Greeks and the Romans, you've got historians who research, compare different accounts, and try and come to the most accurate picture of the past. Sure, they may exaggerate the number of people in a battle, but it's pretty solid history. Our modern idea of history comes directly from them, and it's their tradition we follow when we think about history to this day. But somewhere between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the Renaissance, that tradition was lost, and instead you have chroniclers. And these guys had a very different view of history. They would write what they knew and sort of fill in the rest. And very often, they'd write what they felt should have happened from a biblical perspective or a storytelling perspective, rather than what really did happen. And as these were often written to aggrandize a king or intended to fit moral instruction for the church, there was some pretty major differences between what did happen and what should have happened. For example, right, in this story, did everyone really rise up and spontaneously shout, "Deus Vult!" to kick off the crusade? In my opinion, probably not. But it's the first thing that anybody learns about the crusade. Like seriously, any course you ever take about the crusade, this is the first thing they'll tell you. It's all because I think only one, so far as I remember, chronicler, who wasn't even at the Council of Clermont, decided to put that fact in there. And for details like that, these small details, the Chronicles are actually the only source we have for this period. So whenever you're dealing with the Crusades, whether it's in school or in a book or here with us, that's our primary sources. Not exactly what you hope for, so just know that going in. Oh, and one more thing to clear up before we move on. Emico's terrible crusade of horribleness and the people's slightly less terrible crusade of only pretty badness happened at almost exactly the same time. And when I first tried writing this, I tried hopping back and forth between the two, but it killed the flow and made everything a lot more confusing. So I opted to start with Emico's crusade because it left while Peter was still gathering everyone to go wander off to the east. But something that on reflection might have gotten muddled a bit was the fact that Emico spent so long persecuting Jews that Peter actually beat him to Hungary. So when the King of Hungary smashes Emico's crusade, it's in part because he already had to deal with Peter and the People's Crusade. Oh, speaking of Emico, oh God, how do I do this? There's one really funny thing I have to say, and one really dark thing. Let's go with the funny one first. So, you know how the Crusade was supposed to be helping the Byzantines? Well, Emico told people that Christ really wanted him to march on Constantinople, and not actually the Holy Land, take over the city, declare him the last world emperor, and start the end times and fight the Antichrist. So yeah, so much for helping Constantinople. And as far as people who followed him, some of the people who believed him when he said this also worshipped a goose and believed it was inhabited by the Holy Spirit and that they were following it on crusade, not really Emico. So that's the quality of Emico's troops. I don't really know how to transition to the next part, but the heavy bit. Emico's campaign, as stupid and abortive as it was, is often seen actually as a turning point in anti-Semitism in Europe. While there had always been anti-Semitism, this is the first case of really large-scale organized violence against the Jewish community, and the anti-Jewish fervor that it whipped up is often cited as the root of some of the later anti-Semitic laws. This may leave you wondering, okay, so what happened to Emico after all this? Well, he of course survived, promptly abandoned his sacred crusading vow, and went back home to live the rest of his life as if nothing happened. So there's that. But enough with Emiko. Let's talk crazy facts about everybody else. Hugh joined the crusade because he saw an eclipse. Raymond lost his eye on pilgrimage and kept the dried out husk in his pocket, supposedly for good luck. Bohemond was totally Anna Komnena, the emperor's daughter, totally her teen crush, which makes things a little bit awkward as she provides us with the most reliable account of the Crusades of any of the contemporary sources, and only occasionally strays into passages describing Bohemond like, he was so tall in stature that he overlapped the tallest by nearly 1 cubit, narrow in waist and loins, with broad shoulders and a deep chest and powerful arms, and in the whole build of the body was neither too slender nor overweighted with flesh, but perfectly proportioned, and, one might say, built in conformity with the canon of Polycletus. His skin all over the body was white, and his face, the white was tempered with red. His hair was yellowish, but did not hang down to his waist like that of other barbarians, for the man was not inordinately vain of his hair, but had it cut short to the ears. Whether his beard was reddish or any other color, I cannot say, for the razor had passed over it very closely and left the surface smoother than chalk. His blue eyes indicated both a high spirit and dignity, and his nose, the nostrils breathed in the air freely. His chest corresponded to his nostrils, and by his nostrils, the breath of his chest. And speaking of Bohemond, remember the room that overflowed with treasure? Well, most of the accounts I've read, that's literally how they describe it. So I just imagine him turning the corner and just seeing gold pouring out to the hall. Oh, and remember how Bohemond's nephew, Tancred, never took the oath to Alexius Komnenos to return territory? Well, he and Bohemond timed it so that way Tancred would actually arrive in Constantinople at night, and then he furiously rode through the city, so he'd be on a ship before dawn. So, no, they weren't trying to have him avoid that oath at all. Oh, next, broth, totally now a word. Moving on, I want to talk a little bit about place names. I'm using the names for places that the Byzantines and Crusaders would have called them, because the Turkish names were actually harder to find in some cases, and probably wouldn't do us any favors on the pronunciation score. So if we ever look at these things from the other side, we will probably try to do this, but for right now, just know these are the Byzantine and Crusaders place names. Oh, and remember how Alexius ended up in possession of Nicaea and captured the Turkish Sultan's wife and children? He actually returned them safely to Kelij Aslan without even asking for ransom. So throughout all this, there were some people who were civilized, which actually, now that I think about it, leads me to a couple of the patron voters questions. Luke Haynes and Sephardic wanted to know how much territory the Byzantines got back during the Crusades. And they actually got back most of Anatolia and some of the outlying lands. And Sephardic also wanted to know if the Crusades were good for the Byzantines in the end. And that's a really complex question. The short-term answer is yes. The long-term answer is a pretty resounding no. But I'm not going to go into that anymore here, lest I spoil something that will someday certainly be another episode. And I want to talk about Baldwin becoming the Count of Edessa. And Alan and Johnny wanted to know about this as well, so here we go. I'm going to just give the short version off the top of my head, so forgive any lies and the lies, but remember when Baldwin just sort of wanders off and conquers another kingdom and kind of abandons the crusade? It's actually because one of his close advisors, a dude named Bagrat, convinced Baldwin that he should head to the east, into Armenia, because by now the crusade wasn't looking very good for Baldwin, and according to Bagrat, the local Christians in Armenia would welcome him with open arms. Oh, and by the way, Bagrat, probably Bagrat, right? That's probably how you actually pronounce that name. But if you read about this guy, Bagrat is totally the name we should go with. Now, Bagrat's an Armenian, and he probably thinks the king will hire Baldwin, to kick the Turks out of Armenia, and then he, Bagrat, will either end up with some really good position, or given how unpopular the current king is, maybe even become king. So Baldwin gets Bagrat to introduce him to the king. And the king's a Christian, and he's childless, and he's desperately looking for support because he's unpopular enough not to have a power base in his own country. So Baldwin makes chummy with the king, and the king adopts him as an heir. And a few months later, Baldwin lets an assassination plot go through that he almost certainly knew about, and bang! Baldwin, only by selling out his adopted father, is now king of Armenia. But Bagrat, who may well have been noble of birth, as Bagrat was also the dynastic name of Armenian kings before they were all kicked out, he isn't happy at all. This isn't what he planned. So he starts making some noise about being discontented, which prompts some other members of the Armenian nobility who want to ingratiate themselves with Baldwin to accuse Bagrat of conspiring with the Turks. Baldwin, always a big one for loyalty and friendship, has him promptly arrested and tortured. But apparently not killed, by the way. That was my mistake on the show. When rereading things to prepare for lies, I saw that apparently he escaped into the hills after being tortured by his friend Baldwin. And after this, Baldwin actually does recruit the local Christians to bulk up his army, takes his remaining knights, sweeps an ever-widening area, and creates the county of Edessa. So Baldwin wasn't actually incompetent, he's just kind of a jerk. Also in episode 5, when the Crusader foraging party just happens to run into reinforcements for Antioch, the Muslim reinforcements, that's because they were slowed down because they tried to take Edessa back from Baldwin on the way. I always think it's interesting to imagine what would have happened if they weren't. Think how differently this would have all turned out if those forces arrived behind the Crusaders as they were arrayed trying to still besiege Antioch. The First Crusade is so weird because it hinges on so many tiny twists of fate. Which of course brings us to Antioch. First off, Comet landed in the middle of the Turkish camp during this thing, and it's starting to get weird how many of these battles that we end up talking about have astrological events that just happen in the middle of them. And second, I have to talk about this awesome moment where the Crusaders are besieged. They're fighting on all sides, right? They're fighting desperately without rest. There are forces in the citadel, there are forces outside, and battles, not going great. And so, one at a time, men start to desert. But they're in the city, right? So they have nowhere to go. So these guys who desert, they just sort of hide out in the houses on the far side of the city. And Bohemond gets word of this. And Bohemond realizes they need those men. They're not going to win this fight without those extra men. But he also can't spare guys to go haul them out of these houses. So he sends a few men with the orders, just go light the whole district on fire. And so Bohemond just starts a cataclysmic blaze in the middle of an occupied city that he's trapped in. And it works. The guys rush out of the houses, which are now on fire, and there's nowhere to go but the front lines. So they're all back in battle. Oh, and that reminds me, if why the Muslim forces fled was at all confusing, here's a little bit better of a breakdown. Their commander was a guy named Kerboga, and he was the Atabeg of Mosul. Atabeg is basically a duke. And all the other Muslim commanders were lesser nobles under him, as was the way with feudal armies. They had to fight under his banner whenever he marched off to war, right? So, now the thing is, all these lesser commanders, all these lesser nobles, basically got nothing if Antioch was captured, and Kerboga, their Atabeg, would become even more powerful and be able to exert more control over them if he succeeded. Whereas if he failed, he'd be disgraced and they'd have more free reign and they could get back to their own fiefs rather than wasting all these resources on this stupid battle. So just as the European forces weren't one unified front, neither were the forces opposing them. And so as soon as the Europeans gave the Muslim forces an excuse that they could legitimately use to sort of flee, most of the sub-commanders were like, looks good to me, and hightailed it out of there, right? And it's one of those interesting cases where the interests of the nation are clear, but the human elements that theoretically are supposed to be supporting that nation have other conflicting goals. When you see those moments in history where you have to just scream out, why didn't they just do this? This is so often the case. We had another question from the Patreons. Our patron Anders asks, whatever happened to the forces that were holed up in that citadel? Well, funny story that. They surrendered, but they surrendered specifically to Bohemond. Somewhere in there, during all that chaos, Bohemond got someone to offer them terms so he could wind up with the citadel himself. And with Citadel, he'd wind up with control of the city. So rather than working all together as Crusaders, he sort of did an end run and got them to give him this, which is one of the reasons that he ends up getting the city himself in the end. Oh, and on a totally different note, remember that clergyman who challenged the guy who claimed to have found the Lance of Longinus to a trial by fire for sacrilegious claims? Well, that clergyman, he later found the true cross. So suck on that. Stephen was asking about Tancred conquering Bethlehem. And I wish there was a better story here, but basically he just swept it up real quick. There weren't any major forces there. Tancred did some smashing, grabbed up Bethlehem, and this is one of the reasons why when Godfrey is made the ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, he decides to make Tancred the Prince of Galilee. Oh, speaking of which, you know in episode 6, when Raymond takes one side of the wall when they're assaulting Jerusalem and Godfrey and Tancred take the opposite side? This probably had less to do with tactical concerns than the fact that basically both Godfrey and Tancred really didn't like Raymond at this point. Though Raymond did one cool, if completely heartless thing during this, there was this dry moat around Jerusalem, and it would have stopped any assault just dead in its tracks, and they needed to fill it to assault the walls. But every time a group of soldiers tried to do so, they'd come under heavy fire, and soon no one was willing to try and fill it in. So Raymond, who was just exceedingly rich, offered everybody a penny to throw a stone or a clod of earth into this dry moat. All of a sudden, a lot of people turned brave, and the moat got filled. I have so much more, but I want to make sure we address some of the things that you guys raised in the comments. First off, there were some questions about Muslim atrocities. And the truth is, I try and show both perspectives and sort of see both sides in these things, and I try and represent them as much as I can without bias. That's why I made sure to call out the bishops who straight up heroically defended the Jewish populations of their towns. But the more that I read, the harder it was to really defend the Crusades. I mean, this thing was a mess. And while there were some acts of violence by the Muslims in the Holy Land before the Crusades, on a whole, for a conquest of this scale during this time period, the Muslim conquest and occupation was actually pretty benign. If you want to talk about Muslim atrocities, you look at their conquest of India, where they weren't dealing with people of the book. That's a whole nother story, a terrible and violent one, and one we may well cover someday. But I swear, I was trying to be as fair to the Crusaders as I humanly could be. And the thing is, we don't need to grasp at straws to find justifications for these men. This is part of our history, and we should look at it honestly. The fact that this is part of our history doesn't make us bad, or the church that these men believed in bad. It's something to learn from, and to help us understand the present. But with that said, I want to get to the rest of your thoughts, so I'm going to try and rapid fire through a lot of these. First off, you're all 100% right in calling me out and saying Germany. There wouldn't be a Germany for almost 800 years. Second, the indulgence thing. Basically, this is where the idea of mass indulgences spring from. But indulgences are super complicated, so I may have understood it wrong. My understanding is basically if you commit a sin and confess, you're assigned penance. And as I follow it, the offer here is that going on crusade counts as all your penance. So you confess all your sins, you're assigned penance, you go on crusade, boom, penance is wiped out. But many of you may understand this a lot better than me, so I totally defer to you guys in this one. Oh, and this is awesome. I get to do this. This is gonna be fun. One I loved, it's going to be a comments lies. Priests didn't use bladed weapons. That came up a lot. This is actually false. This is a myth that became part of our popular culture because of D&D. It's actually completely wrong. You can look at the Song of Roland, and Archbishop Turin, right, lays about with his sword of burnished steel. So this was just fantastic to me because I've made this mistake before. I ended up having to look it up because D&D taught me the same thing. And when I looked up years ago, it's always struck me, so it just amused me seeing that. Oh, and yes, in that vein, totally historically accurate that Raymond has a magic moving eye patch. And as mentioned here, Beaumont was actually clean shaven, had short hair. Our artist, when doing the original character sketch, was looking at a highly romanticized 19th century painting of him as a reference image. and I didn't see it till it was too late, and it would have been too confusing to change it. Oh, and whoever you are who made a YouTube account for Robert of Flanders just to pop in comment threads and say, "We cool," you are a hero. And in episode 4, some people were questioning 7-hour shield defense. This is actually fairly well attested to. As far as the singing goes, some people were asking, oh, would they really do that to inspire the troops? It was less to inspire the troops than an attempt by the priest to keep the civilians from panicking. Oh, and in episode 5, we mentioned that Antioch was founded by Alexander. This is false. It was founded by his general Seleucus. In episode 6, people wondered why the Genoese were showing up. They were just basically bringing supplies, but because an Egyptian fleet came in and blocked their way back home, the sailors just joined the crusade and let the Crusaders take apart their ships for wood. Oh, also, the guy who found the lance of Longinus was not local. As we somehow said, he was from France. That's actually an editing error. I forgot to delete a word from a sentence that I was changing, so the word local stayed in there wrong. I think that's about it for what I can remember from the comment threads, so I'm just gonna lightning fast through the last patron questions. Let's just go through. Cameron asks about how the language barrier affected the Crusades. I'm sure it had a big effect on the regular troops and kept them from sort of becoming one cohesive army, but overall it had a lot less effect than you'd expect because all the nobles shared a few languages, at the very least Latin. Let's see, Joshua asks why this is called the Prince's Crusade when later Crusades are called the Royal Crusade, and is that part of why it's more successful? And in fact, it actually might be, because it's called the Prince's Crusade as opposed to later Crusades, which were the Royal Crusades, because none of these guys were actually kings, right? They were all noble people, but they weren't kings, which meant that many of them were out to carve their own kingdoms and to stay instead of to fight for a bit and leave and go back home to their own kingdoms, which probably did have an effect on sort of the tenacity of this crusade. Krista asks about civilian casualties and if there was any estimate for civilian casualties. Not that I can find. Unfortunately, people didn't really tally up peasants. Trevor wants to know if there were any stories that I didn't get to, but I was really interested in. The rest of Alexius Komnenos' reign, Alexius Komnenos is really interesting because he tries to wrench back the Byzantine Empire to some state of relevance. And I love to go deeper into it because from the little bit I got to look at, right, he's really successful in the time, he's a lot of really good ideas, but these ideas in the end are also some of the things which led to the eventual decline of the Byzantine Empire. Alexander asks about who the unsung heroes of the Crusades are. And I really thought, a lot of these bishops who defended the Jews really are unsung heroes. Like, you never hear about them. I thought some of them went above and beyond to try and protect people, which I thought was awesome. Tancred is my other favorite. The more I read about him, the more I liked him. And maybe because it's in contrast to some of the company he kept, but he's this kid who shows up and sort of just brought along by his uncle. And this is his journey to prove he's his own man. And as he struggles with that, and as he needs to prove himself a great warrior, he tries within the bounds of the time, but certainly more than anybody else there, to be humane. So I would say Tancred as well. Lastly, Paul asks, how much did the invasions of Spain and France have to do with calling of the Crusades? Specifically calling of this first crusade. And actually that's Spain and France, whole different thing. Urban II actually had to convince many of the knights who were fighting over in Spain to stay in Spain. He had to actually send out a special message saying, hey, we're gonna give you guys all the same indulgence. Please don't stop the war over there to try and go over to Jerusalem. So there it is. Oh, and finally, to end things where all things end, Walpole. You may be asking yourself, how's he gonna tie Walpole to the Crusades? But let me tell you, it's Walpole's son who profiteered off the Crusades in the best possible way. He wrote the first Gothic romantic novel. And you may think I'm done. You may think, okay, case closed. This can't get any better than the sentence, first Gothic romantic novel. But how does this tie back to the Crusades? Well, you see, he didn't claim to write the book. He didn't even claim to pseudonymously write the book. He made up a fake person who then made up a fake story that this came from a fake attic of an ancient fake family, and that this was a translation of a work dating back from, you guessed it, the Crusades. So Walpole runs in the family. And there you have it, Walpole in 1. So join us next time for the greatest naval adventure of all time, the tale of an admiral who is seriously unsurpassed in the history of the world, and yet is little known outside of his native land. So yeah, join us next time for the tales of Admiral Ian.